Hello, writers and crafters. I'm Valerie Isan.
And I'm Eric Mertz.
And this is episode 50 of the podcast. It feels
Wow.
like a monumental slice of, it's not as huge as 100, but it still feels like a, what did Zach Bohannon used to call it in the Career Author podcast? Landmark episode.
Well, you can't get to 100 without 50. So
yeah.
Right. We'll pop that champagne probably in almost a year. And
Oh, yeah. Well, we should also say it's January 11th, 2022 as we record this. And today we're going to be talking about protagonist needs and wants. But first, what's up, dude?
What's up? Well, I finished my first short story of the year.
Yay.
Which was really exciting. There was a anthology that I wanted to submit to, and I had a story idea floating around, and so I just, it was my first mission of the year. So I took that old story idea that I'd been tinkering with and wrote it up and submitted it.
Remind us what your goal was about short stories this year.
I didn't set a goal for short stories necessarily.
Okay.
Well, that's not true either. I like writing short stories. I mean, I have a book series, and a book series is great because it gives you, you're driving toward, a bigger project, but it can get a little claustrophobic. So I set out to write a few extra short stories this year, things that didn't have anything to do with my story world. So there was a anthology out there for the 50th anniversary of Kolchak, which was an old, paranormal mystery television show back in the 70s. They were doing like an open call for new stories involving that character, and I had a story that fit. And it was fun. It's not in my, like I said, not in my story world. And it just gives me that feeling of just circulating in a new space.
Mm-hmm.
So submitting that was great. I finished it, got the edits together, and submitted it at noon, and very liberating feeling. It's
Awesome.
Just great.
So is there a vetting process? I mean, is there still a...
Yeah, it's a big anthology. There's a lot of
When will you know if you've made it to the next level?
I think that is going to be like April or May. They said they were going to, the call was open. Well, it said open until filled, which I'm going to guess every editor uses that to if I were an editor, at least I would just I'm just waiting. If that great story comes in at the 11th hour, I'll accept it. So yeah, I think it fit really well. Kolchak's a great series, and so yeah, it was fun to do that, and to stamp finished on something. It was good. What about you? What's going on in your world?
Well, I had done some end of the year review, and I had I learned a lesson last year, and that was that it was okay to grow slow, because I am pathologically impatient with myself. And I set myself, first of all, I do too many things at once. And there's been several conversations that have popped up in my environment professionally and in my friendship circle and at home that all seem to revolve around that same idea of you've got too many balls in the air and you need to do something about it. And that always elicits so much panic in me, because I feel like if I set down one of the balls, I'm never going to get back to it.
Right.
And also I have discovered in these multiple conversations, which says something to me, by the way, like if the universe is bringing you the same message, repeatedly over and over and over again, that's one thing. But if it happens in the span of 2 weeks, then it's okay, well, I guess maybe I should be listening to this and do something about it. So I kind of forgot where I was going with that, but yeah, there's a lot of balls and I got to set some down and I'm afraid to, and I don't know which ones to set down. And I know that I can be more productive if I pick one or two or three things to kind of focus on for the year. And it's hard for me to only choose three.
Right.
So I'm kind of in that like weirded out place where I have to make some decisions and I'm not sure which way to go, because I'm
Right.
super excited about all of the projects and I want to work on them all at the same time right now.
Right. Right.
Something else I learned about myself in the last, my dog is grunting right into the microphone. Can you hear it?
I can hear that. Yes.
Let me see if I can put him down. He's one of those little tiny chihuahuas that wants to be held all the time. Normally I have a little pack in here where I can put it on, but they're all in another room right now. So I know that something else that's come up for me is that I don't put enough time to a task. So
Mhm.
for instance, I think something will take me an hour and a half and really it will take me 5 hours. And I don't want it to take me 5 hours. So I just tell myself it's only going to take me an hour and a half,
Right.
which ends up, of course, causing a whole lot of anxiety and,
Right.
overwhelm and stuff. So I
And
need to
that
look.
that right there shows you the limit of will, right? Like you can't will a 5-hour task into an hour and a half. You just can't.
You
You
can
can
get better
maybe
at
get
it though, like if you do it repeatedly, then
right.
eventually it won't take you 5 hours. But yeah.
Yeah.
So I have to be more realistic with myself. And that's where that pathological impatience comes in. I just want things to take less time.
Well, I
So,
think that's, I think anybody listening could probably benefit from that, because it's, as an entrepreneur, if you are already in the entrepreneurial space, that is, I'm sure most entrepreneurs have that feeling of opportunity. You got into entrepreneurial things because you wanted to follow opportunities and make your own way.
mhm.
And by putting those balls down, that's a struggle because, right? Doesn't it feel like you're giving up a little bit of that entrepreneurial spirit?
Or just, yeah. I mean, I want to be able to know that I'll go back to that ball,
Right.
but does giving up the ball right now look unprofessional? Does it say to myself that it's less important than the other balls? Those are
Right.
the angsty kinds of things that go through my mind when I contemplate
Right.
prioritizing, which I've always hated the word.
I tried to do that last week. I sat down and I did like my quarter one. These are the things I'm going to do realistically. And the hardest part of that for me was not just making a bigger to-do list for quarter two. I mean, that was the impulse, was like, oh, well, all right, I'll show you quarter one. If you're going to limit me, I'm going to make this bigger list for quarter two. But by the end of that exercise, I had to say, okay, quarter two, I'm going to feed you, and here's what you're going to do. But I could tell that similar feeling, or my manifestation of that feeling, was coming through, where it was like, I was so worried about putting down that ball that I just had to I had to put it somewhere or
Uh-huh.
I was going to lose it,
I
which,
remember one time I came back from it was the business mastery class that Dean Wesley Smith and Christine Catherine Rush put on. It was still in Lincoln City and it was 2017. And I came away from that week-long master class with I typed up all my notes. I separated them out to like cool things to remember, and then like the action step things, like the things I wanted to do based on
right.
the stuff I learned there. And there were like 5 pages of single space tasks. And
Wow.
I ended up like creating kind of a 5-year plan out of it, because I started, like you did, I started like, okay, by the end of this year, I could probably do these and these and these. And okay, this is getting kind of long. So I'm going to drop this into next year or next quarter. And then that just got bigger and bigger. And so I finally had to start shoving things into like year 2, year 3,
Right. Right.
which actually made me feel better, because it wasn't me putting down a ball. It was just slating it for a different
Right.
time, which is all putting down the ball means, but
Right.
now we're mixing metaphors and all that. So
But
anyway,
you're at least acknowledging where what you put down is going to go. And I think that acknowledges your need to stay, entrepreneurial and creating new things and doing that, but also respects the fact that you can't do all of it at once.
Right. Time is finite and damn
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
And the energy is finite and
Right.
yeah.
And just, as
I
we were
want to
talking
be
about,
Wonder Woman though.
but as we talked about setting up a podcast date, it's like you had a phone call, there's vet appointments, there's kids coming home from school. So you also like have to live a life, and that's
Yes, we are
a
flexible.
challenge.
I just finished reading a book called Blind Man's Bluff by, I forgot the author's name. I should have written it down before I came, but it was a memoir that I heard recommended on Rachel Herron's podcast for some writing style that I was interested in and seeing how someone else did. So I've just finished reading that. It was a really quick read. I buzzed right through it. It was about a man who lost his sight as a teenager, and how he kind of sort of hid that disability from everybody he knew, and how he was able to do that. And it was really interesting. So I like that. I just finished that. I'm also reading Chasing Shadows.
Oh wait, I know that book.
I know that book. Listeners, this is Eric's next book. And I kind of set seed to
when you said that, I
aside.
actually panicked a little bit, like, oh my God, there's another book with that name, and oh no, that's a problem. Maybe it's not a problem, I don't know.
No, I'm reading your book right now. I'm almost done with it too. And Seed to Dust is still in my bag. I pull it out every once in a while. It's just that pretty nature writing, and after a while, like, it can't like take 400 pages of it. Right. I mean, it's beautiful, but I'm not always in the mood for quiet contemplation and, reading about nature.
Right.
Often I am. So it's a good book, but sometimes
it's also hard at this time of year to do too much nature reading, because you're so estranged. I feel estranged from nature at this point. Even when I go out on a hike, it's like, this is not like postcard level Oregon. This is more like I need to get my steps in level Oregon. Yeah, I picked up a book I've actually lost it. It was on my Goodreads. I was currently reading this book for about a year and a half. I couldn't find it. Turns out it was nowhere near where a book should be in my world, but it's Thomas Ligotti's Grim Scribe and Dead Dreamer stories. He's a horror author. They're very like, you want to talk about, it's like the nature writing for horror authors. It's all atmosphere. It's all shadows and dark corners and, dank air, and very, nothing much happens, but you leave every story with just like a, feeling. You just
creepy feeling.
Yeah. It's just,
I don't know. If I could go there.
Oh, it's so what I do when I read Thomas Ligotti is I have like many issues of Poetry magazine sitting by my bedside too. The last thing I read is not Thomas Ligotti. It will be like something out of Poetry magazine. Okay. Because it's just a palate cleanser, Right. It's that ginger after a really, hot bite of sushi. And then I can go to sleep. But if I went to sleep after some of those stories, I would not be well. They're not well stories.
Your quality of sleep would take a nosedive.
It would, sure. All right. We're going to talk about characters, right?
Yeah. Specifically wants and needs. I think that when you start a story, part of what hooks the reader into continuing to read is the atmosphere. Is this intriguing, or is the character in a weird place that you've never been in before? So there's a lot of reasons I think a reader goes to the page.
Right.
And so some of those have to be addressed in the first, few pages. Otherwise they're not going to keep reading. And one of those things can be a unique, need or want, right, which I think kind of usually coincides with like an inciting incident or something in that world is perplexing or dangerous or, depending on your genre, whatever. Right. So I think that the external want almost always coincides with an internal need.
Right.
That's my hypothesis anyway.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, I think you hit on two things. Like when you talk about genre, there's some genre specifics here. I think that if you're doing mystery, you're doing any kind of detective or thriller or something, that person has to, they need to solve the case. They need to discover the bigger truth. And so that's important. But I think I think you hit it right on the head that, you have a character who's evolving and changing with the story, and that evolving sort of internal need, something in the external world of the story, has to spur something in them. It has to, I think character changes according to their, psychology and their sometimes their physicality or whatever, but eventually it's something in the external world, pricks that sense of like need and puts it into action. Like they can't put that mission down. And that's an interesting balance.
It's intrinsically woven with the other thing then, right?
Right.
Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think that I think if it was all an external motivation, then it wouldn't, I think that a reader would see their way through that, right? It would just be this external validation. It wouldn't carry the substance of.
And there are some genres that are specifically that way, though. We should say that too. There are some stories where there is no character growth, there is no internal drive. It's just the
Are you
outside.
thinking of like romance maybe, or
no, more like the James Bond kind of
Oh,
stuff,
okay.
where there really isn't a character development that's happening. He's not growing through the story. He's just dealing with the spies and the action
Right.
and stuff like that, and that is okay for some genres, like spy
I agree.
thrillers.
Yeah, you're right.
I think the story is better though if you have that internal character world and having character growth.
Well, those last 3 or 4 movies, the James Bond series, they tried to go into a character that's dynamic and changing and evolving and making.
And those were better, I thought. Those were more interesting.
Way better, way better. And I can reflect on some book. I remember at the paperback exchange when I was young, you'd get these just like 150-page action adventure books that I don't even know if those are around anymore, if anybody's really writing those, but they would be almost like an episode of the A-Team in book form.
Right.
And there wasn't a lot of dynamic character there. And we should also sort of be making the distinction between like main character and other characters, right? So you
True.
have,
including the villain.
Right. So we want to talk about like not everyone in your book is going to have this major, epiphany and transformation and a dynamic series of wants and needs. Other characters that are attached to the main character will have they will be dynamic, but they can't, there's sort of it's like a hierarchy of that dynamic in a book, right?
I think that comes from knowing whose story it is.
You want to talk about that? Because I think that's always I think that's very compelling when you read a first draft, or you read just an early draft. I've heard myself say it. I've heard other authors. I've heard people say it to me. Whose story is this? And that can be a struggle.
Yeah. I remember with my first novel, it's told in 2 different points of view, a mother and a daughter. And they both have their own struggles and their own story. And there was a writing teacher that asked me that. And I was like, well, it's both of their stories. And he was like, you got to pick one, there's one main character. You can have a secondary character that is also telling the point of view story, but there's got to be one main one, so I ended up having to like I didn't change anything, but I really looked at the story and realized that, there was clearly one person, and that was Catherine, the mother.
Right.
It was really her story.
I had somebody ask me that in an early screenplay draft. I was working on the project with another writer who was twice my age and 10 times the writer I was at that time. And I remember him saying like, well, whose point of view, who's the main character, whose story is it? And I froze. I remember freezing over that answer because I didn't know. Um, and then I kind of had to force myself to learn it so I could answer his question at a later date. But it's hard sometimes to know, and it's difficult. I see this a lot in early drafts of people I work with too, and that is everybody in the book is going through this this mega change, and it really kind of floods the whole book with a lot more happening. And although the main character is more hinges on what the changes the main character is going through, it's still a waterfall of major changes. So I think you have to be really mindful of main character, major transformation. Dorothy gets to go home at the Wizard of Oz. That's the major point of the story. But everybody else gets what they need to a less of a degree in its effect on the story.
Mm-hmm. And this is totally beside the point, but I think it's really interesting when authors take an existing story and then retell it from the point of view of one of the minor characters.
Wizard of Oz brought that up for you, right?
Yeah, because I'm thinking of Gregory Maguire, the Wicked and the something of Courage. I forget the title. And the one about the Cinderella's ugly stepsisters. But that one, so good, so good, so good. I think that's super interesting. My husband actually thinks that is, what is the word he uses? He's kind of a snob about art.
Good.
He said it's derivative. He doesn't like stuff that
interesting,
pulling from other people's originality. And I'm like, how is that? I mean, that's just a random idea. It's a what if. It's a what would this story be like? What is hers? I don't think it's derivative at all.
I don't think it's derivative at all either. But I wouldn't say at all. I don't think it's derivative, but I think you could have that conversation about come up with your own story world. But that said, it is fun to play in the world of something established and twist that view. I mean, we're all watching Star Wars, the 800th retelling of the Star Wars story from a different. And I say that half jokingly. I eat it up like every other fan, but I want to see what Boba Fett's core needs and wants are, because in those early movies, I didn't get to see that. He was just a guy.
The story is completely different. You just happen to have, some other character from history,
right,
or fantasy world that you're getting inspiration from. I think that's all it is.
Right. I think so too.
So
Ali, come on, buddy. Ali.
He won't listen to this. So I have a question for you then.
Okay.
Do you think writers should have the character's internal need and the external want figured out before they start writing? Do you think that has to happen?
I don't think so, no, because I think that especially if somebody's new to a draft, new to writing a book, or new to a storyline, I think that discovery draft is valuable. And as a side note, we're talking about short stories. I think you could write a short story to discover that. But I think there is some of that discovery that can come on the page. It can come from feedback, right? So like, just for example, like the book that you're reading of mine, that is really two emotional storylines for the main character compressed into one book. I was spreading some of that story revelation out into a second book. My writing group was like, no, like that is too important of a need for him, and it's too connected to his want in the story. You have to move that. And so really my first draft of that book was the discovery draft that urged me to pull things forward. So I don't think you have to map all that stuff out to a fine point before you write it. But you have to know the character. That's the other caveat. You have to know who that character is. You have to know what makes them work. Otherwise,
but then it sounds like you're contradicting yourself.
Did I?
It sounds like it. If you know the character and you know what makes him tick, then you know what his internal need is. whether the character knows or not.
Well, I think, okay, so I did somewhat contradict myself, but I guess what I'm really saying is like relative to that story, right? So then if you're writing a series, you're writing something that's ongoing, you're going to have to tease that thing out you have to evolve it over a long period of time. The arc is in the book and then in the series. So I think that, I think you have to be open to how that's going to manifest on a story by story basis. If you're writing a one-off, maybe like it's a less, that's maybe more of what I was saying before, right? Like you could just give it a whirl, see what happens. But if you are in a series thing or you're working with an established character, I think, you can kind of explore how that's going to manifest in that episode.
I think I might disagree with you.
Oh, good. Well, what do you think?
I think back to Libby Hawker's book. I love that book, but what I like about it most is the character flaw aspect of it. I think that was totally mind-blowing for me because like I said before in another episode, I really tried to squish all my manuscripts into the hero's journey and it just did not work sometimes. Right. And it made me feel like a bad writer because I was doing something wrong. But I think that if you know what the character's flaw is and therefore the need, if the character's flaw is that they don't trust anybody, then you know that the internal need is for her to trust somebody. And if you know what that internal need is, then that can help you decide what kinds of plot devices you're going to need in order for her to overcome that flaw and get her need met by the end of the story. So I think that the internal need and the external want are intrinsically woven through the character arc itself. Now, I think that also the need can change. At the beginning of the story, the author can think, well, this is what the character needs. And by the time you're like halfway through, maybe you think, oh, it's part of that discovery writing. Maybe you change your mind and you see after getting to know the character that really what she wants is this, or needs. And you can, then go back and change and edit the first part of it that you've already written to make that change, to make that work. So
I was reading an interesting interview. I'm not going to remember who the author was. I've actually been picking at this long book of interviews with mystery authors. And I found it compelling read for me because it's authors who've been writing a 25 page book series involving, a single detective or officer or whomever, whatever profession. And there are a wide variety of professions that people write crime stories from. It's fascinating to see what people will mine. It's a great, it's really eye-opening. But the point is, talking to those authors about how they sustain an emotional arc with a character over a long period of time. 20 books, that's a long time. If the primary wound of that character is that she was left at the altar in book 1, she can't carry that for 20 books. That becomes repetitious. So that has to evolve itself. And I guess for me, like that discovery draft and that longer process is more like, how is that going to show up this time? Knowing that I used it this way the last time, right? How do I, and you might not know, the external need in each one of those stories is to solve a crime, right? A body is found, somebody was murdered. I guess isn't that the way they all start? Bodies found, and then somebody's got to figure out.
Kind of the obligatory scene. You need to have a body.
There's got to be a body. But the external need is solve the crime, but the internal need is to solve the self through the work or solve the self through the process. And I think that, I think you have to be open to some discovery in how that's going to look for each thing. Otherwise, I just don't think you can map all that out all the time.
No. And especially if you're writing in a series that is more self-contained, like at the end of the story, your mystery is solved, or some of it is, like it's resolved in some way, so that the next book isn't not necessarily needing the first book in the
Right.
series, so, but if it is kind of like Harry Potter, like I feel like she really did some of that work
Yeah.
overarching the 7 books. And then, I mean, I don't know what her process was, but it seems to me like that kind of story really needs to have
Oh,
the pre-work. It's less discovery, but maybe I'm totally wrong. I'm just extrapolating based on having read the series multiple times. And
don't give it away. I'm only halfway through. I'm reading it with my son right now.
that's how I started to reading it with my kids.
Um,
So this is really interesting, actually, because I think going forward in this series of conversations about craft and creativity, Eric, that we're going to get 2 different opinions based on, I write mostly standalones and you write in a series. So seeing if any
Right.
of this is different based on writing
Right.
standalone versus, so I think
I
that's
think
really
we
interesting.
will.
I just now noticed that.
Yeah, yeah. I just noticed it too, and I think we will find those differences. And I think that it's good for people to know that what works. If the end result for each of us is a satisfied reader,
Mhm,
well, on average, a satisfied reader, you can't satisfy everybody, but
mhm.
that's the end result, right? That's what we're all riding toward. And I'll say this to anybody listening: if that's not your goal, then I think you need to reconsider your goal, because a satisfied reader should be the only objective for a writer. Even if you're writing a note to your spouse, you want a satisfied reader. Then, however you get there, I think is puts you like, I think you're worthy of putting some stamp on this kind of conversation. You I couldn't do it the way that somebody else did it, and you couldn't either. And
Mhm.
yeah, it's the mystery of the craft, the magic of the
The
craft that we're.
magic of the craft, yeah, and everybody and voice. Everybody has a different writing style and a different voice too.
Yeah, and if I want to, shout out to a podcast, you do that really well. And I read the Novel Marketing podcast with Thomas Olmsted, and he did an archived episode from 2015 with a short story writer, and he really talked about how writing short stories, that repetition of like getting the story out there, setting up all of the elements that we've talked about, and executing them is a critical practice to getting better at the craft. And if you are leery of starting a 60,000 word book to discover the character, maybe you write a short story. Maybe
Mhm.
you write something more of a cup of coffee than the whole meal story, if you know what I mean, to
Yeah.
understand that primary wound a
When I
little.
get stuck, often I will invite the character to write me a letter.
Oh,
So I'm writing a letter in the character's voice, or like
interesting.
or interviewing the character, and just dictating. So I'm kind of like channeling from the
Inter-
character.
Interesting.
That's how I
Um,
often get to know them better.
I think yeah, I always, I invite myself, like, this sound, you're inviting them to write you a letter, and I'm like inviting myself to write a story about them. I try to write something between each of the books in my head. I try to write an episode, a storyline that's outside of that,
Oh.
to pull me out of the monotony of monotony. I mean, to pull me out of the chronology,
Uh-huh.
and because I think sometimes, like, exploring emotion and feeling and and story elements outside of that chronology, it gives you freedom to explore and say, oh, okay, this is what you're like when you're not on a 75,000 word journey. You're more like this. I can use that. And
So you said something a minute ago about it works if your reader likes what you've written, if they're enjoying the story. So what does it look like when we've got it right? When the characters' wants and needs are clear to the reader? Where does that happen in the book?
where does the where does the point that the character that point of satisfaction comes? Is that what you're?
No. So when I start a book, I have to have that hook. Yeah.
Right.
We talked about that. And really soon into the book, maybe like, I don't know, maybe it doesn't have to be in the first chapter, but pretty close. We we need to know as readers, like, why are we continuing this story? What is it that the character wants? So that becomes kind of like Bill Johnson talks about the story promise.
Right.
So the story promise is this person wants this thing and they're going to go try and get it. And we know as readers that they're going to have a hard time with it. They're going to get shut down a bunch of times and they're going to grow through the process of getting this thing at the end or not. We don't know. And that's why we're reading it, to fall into this world, to follow the character, to be the character. There's lots of reasons why we read, but at the beginning, we need to know what they want or we can't root for them. So if it's not clear, then I don't know, can't get into the story. So what can we do as authors to make sure that our protagonists' wants are clear at the beginning of the book? I don't know that I have a pat answer for that, but
I don't know if I have a pat answer for that either, but I think that I think there's a point in every book where every story, I would say short story, flash fiction, novel series, where the reader is asked to take a bigger leap. This is the journey. Maybe that's chapter 1, maybe that's chapter 3, maybe that's the first page in a short story. I don't know. But I think there's a specific ask in every story that the writer makes of the reader. And that is the point that for me that I need to be hooked at. I need to be hooked at the point where the ask is made of me. I think specifically of The Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan, one of the greatest fantasy epic series ever. There's a point in that first book where you've been in the village, you've seen, everything is, comes to this, like the kind of the mini head of the first act, and you're in for this long, it's a fantasy story, so there's a quest coming.
epic. Yeah. Uh-huh.
At the initiation of that quest, I was in. I was in 100% without question in. And so I think to me, like that, I always think of that book when I think of like the ask in a book. That was the ask. I gave it a thumbs up. I'm on the road and I'm 8 books in and I'm still enjoying them when I pick them up. But I think that's why you need good readers. That's why you need engaged readers, right? And that's why I love my writing group, is that I get 5 people to read every chapter and I get differing opinions about where that emotional connection happens, what they need. And I can kind of synthesize those different ideas and say, all right, okay, this is really where I'm asking the reader to take that journey with me. And so I have to solidify it. Because I don't always know when I'm writing it, when I am making that ask. I don't think you can know. I mean, I think that it would be really difficult as a writer to know, like, okay, this is when precisely the moment that the reader has to be hooked by. I think that's why readers are great. They will tell you. And because I've been wrong about that numerous times. I thought, okay, this is that synthesizing moment. And then when nobody responds to it like that, I'm left holding the bag, sort of, like I was wrong. So I've loaded the wrong moment. But that's why we rewrite things, right? Is that
right? I think sometimes the reasons why I wouldn't get that hook when I'm reading, when I wouldn't answer the call to keep going, would be if I don't understand what he's going for.
right?
If I don't understand the character's motive for doing what he's doing, that kind of loses me too. So I think it kind of, we were talking before we hit record about the overlap of characterization and the character arc and the dialogue and the protagonist needs and wants. And, those kind of sort of blend together to create this characterization that we strive to make so great that the readers don't ever forget our characters. And I think that's this is one of those moments where sort of bleeding into character arc or just creating a character that the reader will like enough to follow, even if it is kind of hazy on like, what does he want? Or, hey, I know he needs this, even if he can't see it, I'm going to see if he can figure it out. Or, or just knowing that he wants this thing, but he just says he wants it. Like, why don't I feel like he really believes it? So there's got to be written into the story some character motive too, so that the reader can follow the track of the protagonist.
Right,
also.
right. Yeah, those things have to be clear, and I think that's always a struggle for me, because in my series, as you're reading, like, one of the main motivations of the character is that he lost his mom. His mom walked out on the family early in his life, and he's never really solved that. He's never healed the wound. He's never solved the mystery, and now he's finding that things in his present day are starting to wrap themselves up in that old wound, that old unanswered question. And I think that can be, that was not something that I thought I would introduce that topic and that would be enough to sustain it. But, as my writing group continues to remind me, keep bringing it up, keep bringing it up, keep bringing that up. And it can feel, and that's a big challenge for a writer, right? Is to understand, like, well, I understand this, and so it's clear, but then you need that reader to tell you.
And how do you know if you're not like beating them over the head with it?
Right. Well, then there you go. Again, you need that reader to say, hey, okay,
Yeah,
enough. Every
sure.
chapter, you don't have to go into a long navel gazing reflection on mom.
Oh.
It's balance. And I think, experience brings answers, personal answers to these questions. And it's also a story by story. It's a story by story thing. Like, the short story I talked about in the beginning that I just finished, established character. I'm using a character from it's a derivative story of an old TV series, but it was easy to get it. Like, I had an established set of needs and wants. It was really simple to do that. If I was creating a new character, it would be different. I'd have to invent that, in a different way every time.
Well, we have gone far over our 30-minute.
Wow, we did.
Yeah, it's been almost 45 minutes. So I think this is a good place to stop. Do you have any announcements you want to make really quick?
No, not really. I mean, just plugging along, I've got another short story on the docket to work out. And other than that, what about you?
Writercraft writing retreat and workshop tickets are available at valerieeson.com/retreat. It is $840 for 3 days and 3 nights, all inclusive, all lodging, all food. And there is monthly payment plans as well. And this podcast is sponsored by our patrons at patreon.com/ValerieEson. Yeah. For as little as $1 a month, you can get a shout out on the podcast and we can make announcements for you. And at other tiers, the benefits increase: free books, accountability Zoom calls, scene analysis, mastermind calls, and even free Writercraft retreat tickets. Become a patron of the arts at patreon.com/ValerieEson, IHSAN. Thanks for joining me today.
Absolutely. My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited. So we should say next week I will be in Florida. Oh. So we will be putting up a pre-recorded episode
okay.
on writing memoir. And we'll see you next time. We'll see you for realsies live in a couple weeks.
Absolutely. See you then.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.